Welcome to Eerie Britain. Tonight's story is taken from a private diary, never meant to be read. It was written by a housekeeper working in a remote English manor, sometime in the early 20th century. What begins as an ordinary record of daily life slowly becomes something far more unsettling.
It arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. The postman, a cheerful chap named David, handed me a small brown paper package. There was no return address. My own name and address were written in a spidery, old-fashioned script. It looked like something from another time. I thanked David and took the package inside. I placed it on my desk, feeling a strange sense of curiosity. It was light, almost weightless, and felt fragile beneath its plain wrapping. The string tied around it was old and frayed, threatening to break with the slightest touch. I remember thinking how odd it was to receive something so anonymous in our modern world. I let it sit there for a while. The package seemed to watch me as I went about my morning routine. I made tea. I checked my emails. But my eyes kept returning to the mysterious object on my desk. Who would send me such a thing, and why? The handwriting was elegant, but it held a faint tremor, as if the writer was old or perhaps afraid. The ink was faded, a pale sepia against the brown paper. It was a relic, a ghost from a time long gone, and it had found its way to my door for reasons I could not begin to understand. The silence of my study seemed to grow deeper, filled with unspoken questions. Eventually, my curiosity won. I carefully untied the string. The knot crumbled into dust in my fingers. The paper was brittle, and it tore as I unfolded it. Inside was a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary, and tucked inside the front cover was a single folded note. The paper was yellowed with age, and the message was written in the same spidery hand as the address. It was short, only 7 words, but they sent a shiver down my spine. She was never meant to be remembered. A strange and chilling instruction for a book that was clearly meant to preserve memories. I held the note for a long time, the words echoing in my mind. Who was she? And why was her memory being deliberately erased? The message felt like a warning, a dark secret passed from one hand to another. It was a puzzle, and the diary was the key. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the weight of a forgotten story. I felt a sense of responsibility, as if a lost soul had reached out across the decades, asking for help. I knew then that I had to read the diary. I had to know the story of the woman who was never meant to be remembered. The diary itself was a thing of simple, worn beauty. Its cover was dark green leather, cracked and faded over time. You could see the faint outlines of a floral pattern pressed into it, now almost completely smooth from years of handling. It was small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. It felt personal, intimate, a secret keeper. The pages were thin, almost like onion skin, and their edges were gilded with a faint touch of gold, now tarnished and dull. The book smelled of dust, old paper, and something else. Something faintly sweet, like dried flowers pressed between the pages a century ago. It was a scent of memory and decay. I opened it carefully, afraid the spine might break. The first page had a name written in neat, careful cursive, Margaret Henshaw. Beneath it, a date, January 1st, 1901, the turn of a new century, a time of great change and hope for so many, but as I would soon discover, not for Margaret. The ink was a deep, dark blue, different from the faded writing on the note. This was Margaret's own hand, her voice, her story. She introduced herself simply. She was a housekeeper, she wrote, a woman of 30 years, unmarried, and about to start a new position in the north of England. Her early entries were filled with a quiet optimism. She wrote about her previous life, working for a kind family in a bustling town. She described her small room, her few possessions, her simple pleasures. Reading her words, I felt I knew her. Margaret seemed like a practical, sensible woman. She was not given to flights of fancy. She was honest and hard-working. She hoped this new job at a grand country estate would offer her security and a peaceful life. She was traveling a long way for it, leaving behind everything she knew. There was a touch of nervousness in her writing, but also a strong sense of duty. This diary was her only companion, her confidant. She wrote in it every night, a ritual to calm her mind before sleep. She poured her hopes and fears onto its delicate pages. She spoke of the long train journey north, of the changing landscape outside her window. The green fields of the south gave way to the stark, windswept moors of the north. She felt a sense of isolation growing with every mile. She was heading into the unknown. Little did she know, she was traveling not just to a new job, but to a place that would consume her, a house that held a darkness far older than its stone walls. Margaret arrived at Blackwood Manor on a grey, drizzly afternoon. She described the journey from the station in a horse-drawn trap. The road was long and winding, climbing higher and higher into the empty hills. The driver was a silent, grim-faced man who offered no conversation. He just pointed once and said, "There it is, Blackwood." The name itself seemed to cast a shadow. Margaret wrote that she felt a sudden chill, a feeling of unease that had nothing to do with the cold weather. The landscape was beautiful in a wild and lonely way, but it was also intimidating. There were no other houses, no signs of life, just the wind and the rain. The house appeared suddenly, a dark shape against the grey sky. It was a large, imposing structure of dark stone covered in ivy. Margaret called it a stone giant. It looked ancient and sad. Many of its windows were dark and empty, like vacant eyes. Smoke curled from only one of its many chimneys. It did not look like a welcoming home. It looked like a place that kept secrets. As the trap pulled up to the enormous front door, Margaret confessed in her diary that her heart was beating very fast. She felt a strong urge to turn back, to tell the driver to take her back to the station. But she was a practical woman. She needed the work. The front door was opened by a butler, who was as old and stiff as the house itself. His name was Mr. Hemlock. He did not smile. He looked at Margaret with cold, empty eyes. He led her through a vast, dark hall. The air inside was cold and smelled of damp stone and beeswax. The silence was the first thing she noticed. It was a heavy, unnatural silence. There were no sounds of family life, no laughter, no conversation. The only sound was the echo of their own footsteps on the polished stone floor. Margaret felt as if she had stepped into a tomb, not a home. Mr. Hemlock showed Margaret to her room. It was a small, plain room in the servants' quarters. It was clean, but cold and cheerless. The window looked out onto a high-walled courtyard. It offered no view of the beautiful, wild landscape she had seen on her way here. She felt trapped, enclosed. The butler gave her a list of her duties and a set of rules. One rule was underlined twice. The West Wing is strictly forbidden to all staff. Do not enter. Do not ask questions. This strange command only deepened her growing sense of dread. Why was a whole part of the house forbidden? What was being hidden there? The days that followed were strange and unsettling for Margaret. She tried to settle into her new routine, but the atmosphere of Blackwood Manor was deeply oppressive. The house was a labyrinth of long, dark corridors and silent, dust-sheeted rooms. Margaret's job was to maintain the few rooms the family actually used. The rest of the manor was left to decay. She wrote that it felt like walking through a museum of a forgotten family. Portraits on the walls watched her with faded eyes. The furniture was covered in white cloths, like rows of ghosts waiting in the gloom. The silence was her constant companion. The master of the house was a Mr. Alistair Blackwood. Margaret saw him only rarely. He was a tall, thin man who seemed to glide rather than walk. He never spoke to the staff. He spent his days locked away in his study. Margaret would sometimes hear him pacing back and forth, the sound echoing in the hallway. He had a sorrowful face, pale and drawn, as if he carried a great burden. His wife, Mrs. Blackwood, was even more elusive. Margaret described her as a whisper of a woman. She was frail and pale, and she drifted through the house dressed in dark, flowing gowns. She never looked anyone in the eye. There were also 2 children, a boy and a girl. They were about 8 and 10 years old, but they were not like any children Margaret had ever known. They were silent. They never ran or played. They never laughed. They would sit for hours in the nursery, staring at the wall or at a book, never turning a page. They moved like little phantoms through the house, their faces pale and serious. When Margaret tried to speak to them, to offer them a kind word or a smile, they would just stare at her with wide, empty eyes before turning and walking away. Their silence was more unnerving than any childish noise. The other staff members were just as strange. There were only a few of them. Mr. Hemlock the butler, a cook, and a couple of maids. They were all quiet and withdrawn. They did their work in silence and avoided conversation. When Margaret tried to ask about the family or the house, they would shake their heads and walk away. They all seemed to be hiding the same secret. They all seemed to be afraid. Margaret felt completely alone, an outsider in this house of ghosts. She wrote in her diary, "It is as if the house itself is holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen." Margaret's unease grew with each passing day. The family's behavior was not just peculiar, it was honestly, deeply disturbing. Mr. Blackwood would sometimes leave his study late at night. Margaret, unable to sleep, would hear his footsteps in the corridor. He would walk towards the forbidden West Wing. He would stand outside the locked door for a long time, just standing there in the darkness. She never heard him try to open it. He would just wait, and then, after what felt like an eternity, he would slowly walk back to his study. What was he doing? What was he listening for? The thought made Margaret's blood run cold. Mrs. Blackwood's behavior was even more worrying. She would often wander the gardens, even in the rain or the bitter cold. She would walk aimlessly, her dark dress trailing on the wet ground. She would talk to herself, whispering words that the wind carried away. Margaret once saw her standing by the ornamental lake, staring at her own reflection in the dark water. Her face was a mask of such profound sadness that Margaret felt a pang of pity for her. But then Mrs. Blackwood looked up, and her eyes met Margaret's across the lawn. There was no sadness in them then. There was only a cold, sharp fear. Mrs. Blackwood quickly turned and hurried back inside. The children continued to be a source of constant bewilderment and fear for Margaret. One evening she was tidying the nursery after they had gone to bed. She found a drawing they had left on the floor. It was drawn in black crayon. It showed a tall, dark house, Blackwood Manor, but there was something wrong with it. All the windows were barred like a prison, and from one window in the west wing, a small, stick-figure person was waving, but the figure was not waving for help. It was waving goodbye. A cold dread filled Margaret. The children knew something. They were trying to communicate in the only way they could. The house itself seemed to be a part of the family's conspiracy of silence. Margaret noticed that many of the windows on the upper floors had iron bars on them, not just in the west wing. They were old and rusted, but they were clearly meant to keep someone in, not to keep intruders out. The doors had heavy bolts on the outside. Why would a family home need such things? It was a prison. But who was the prisoner? Margaret felt a growing conviction that she had not been hired as a housekeeper. She had been hired as a guard, or perhaps a witness to something she could not yet understand. The silence of Blackwood Manor was not always absolute. As the weeks turned into a month, I began to hear things. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the old house settling. But honestly, the sounds became more distinct, more specific. I would hear faint whispers coming from the walls when I was alone in a room. They were too quiet to make out any words, but they sounded like a soft, sad murmur. I would stop what I was doing and press my ear to the cold wallpaper, but the whispering would always stop, as if it knew I was listening. Then came the crying. It always happened late at night, when the house was deep in slumber. It was the sound of a woman weeping. It was a sound of utter despair, of a heart completely broken. The sound seemed to come from far away, from the direction of the forbidden west wing. The first time I heard it, I sat bolt upright in my bed, my heart pounding. I thought it might be Mrs. Blackwood, but the sound was different, younger. I crept out of my room and into the dark corridor, but the sound had already faded, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. I wrote about my growing fear in my diary. I am not imagining these things, I insisted. The sounds are real. I tried to speak to the other maids about it, but they would just look down at their hands and change the subject. Their eyes, however, told a different story. They had heard the sounds too. We were all living in a state of shared denial, pretending not to hear the sorrow that soaked into the very walls of the house. Our silence was a pact, a desperate attempt to keep ourselves safe from whatever haunted Blackwood Manor. One night, the sound was different. It was not whispering or crying. It was a soft, scraping sound, a scratching. It came from the west wing. It sounded like fingernails dragging slowly down a wooden door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was methodical, relentless. It went on for almost an hour. I lay in my bed, frozen with terror, the blankets pulled up to my chin. I imagined someone or something trapped behind that forbidden door, trying to claw its way out. The sound was a plea, a demand to be heard, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. The West Wing became an obsession for me. It was a constant, looming presence in my daily life. The door that led to it was at the end of a long, dark corridor on the first floor. It was a heavy oak door, bound with iron straps. It had a large, complex lock, and Mr. Hemlock was the only one with the key. My duties never took me down that corridor, but I found myself drawn to it. I would find excuses to be near it, just to look at the door and wonder what lay behind it. The air around the door was always colder than the rest of the house. One afternoon I found the corridor empty. On a sudden impulse I walked quietly to the end and stood before the forbidden door. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the cold, rough wood. There were deep scratches on it, just as I had imagined. They were old, but they were undeniably there. Someone had tried to get out. I put my ear to the keyhole, but heard nothing. There was no whispering, no crying, only a dead, empty silence. But I could smell something, a faint, unpleasant smell. It was a smell of sickness and decay. My curiosity was now mixed with a terrible sense of dread. I knew I was in danger. The house was not just sad, it was sick. There was a darkness in it, and it was concentrated in the west wing. I began to have nightmares. I dreamt of the locked door opening. I dreamt of a pale face peering out from the darkness. I dreamt of the scratching sound, but this time it was coming from under my own bed. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The fear was becoming a part of me. I knew I had to leave. I wrote in my diary that I would hand in my notice. I would tell Mr. Hemlock that I was not suited for the position. I would pack my single bag and take the first train back south. I made a plan. I would leave at the end of the week, but a part of me felt a strange pull to stay. I needed to know the truth. Who was crying in the night? Who was scratching at the door? Who was the prisoner of Blackwood Manor? My desire for answers was at war with my instinct for survival. It was a war I was destined to lose. The end came abruptly. The final pages of my diary are frantic, the neat handwriting deteriorating into a desperate scrawl. The entry is dated March 13th, 1901. It is clear that something terrible has happened. I begin by writing that Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood have gone away. They left suddenly in the middle of the night, taking the children with them. They told Mr. Hemlock they would be gone for some time. The house was left with only the skeleton staff, and for the first time, Mr. Hemlock forgot to lock the door to the west wing. I describe finding the door slightly ajar. The lock was undone. The key was gone. I write that I knew I should have walked away. I should have gone to my room and locked my own door, but I could not. The mystery had consumed me. After months of listening to the whispers and the crying, I had to know the truth. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell I had noticed before was overwhelming now. The smell of sickness, dust, and despair. The corridor was dark and coated in a thick layer of dust. The air was heavy and still. I walked down the corridor until I came to a single room at the end. The door was open. Inside, the room was like a cell. The window was heavily barred. The only furniture was a simple iron bed, a small table and a chair. On the bed, the linens were twisted and thrown aside, as if someone had left in a great hurry. But the room was not empty. On the wall, above the bed, words had been scratched into the plaster, dozens of them, over and over again. It was the same name, repeated endlessly, Margaret. That is where my own words become almost unreadable. I write, my name, my name. Why is my name on the wall? My confusion and terror bleed through the ink. I describe a small leather-bound book lying on the table. A diary. It looked exactly like my own. I picked it up. It was filled with writing. It told the story of a young woman, a governess, who came to Blackwood Manor a year before. A woman who became convinced the house was haunted. A woman who was slowly driven mad by the silence and the secrets, until the family locked her away in the West Wing for her own safety. The last entry was dated a week ago. The governess's name was Margaret Henshaw. The diary ends there, on that single terrifying revelation. The last page contains only a frantic, jagged line of ink, as if the pen was dragged across the paper as I was pulled away. There is no explanation, no conclusion, only a sudden, horrifying silence. What happened after I read that other diary? Did Mr. Hemlock find me? Did I meet the same fate as the woman whose identity I had somehow inherited? The diary that I hold in my hands, is it the original Margaret's or the second's? Are they both the same person, caught in some dreadful loop of time and memory? The note that came with the package now makes a terrible kind of sense. She was never meant to be remembered. Was this a warning or a curse? Was the family trying to erase the memory of their crime by replacing one Margaret with another? A new housekeeper with the same name to fill the empty space and continue the cycle. A way to keep the ghost quiet by giving it a new body to inhabit. It is a monstrous thought, but in the oppressive silence left by the diary, monstrous thoughts are all that remain. The story of Margaret Henshaw is a ghost story without a ghost, which is perhaps the most frightening kind. We are left with nothing but questions. What became of the Blackwood family? Did they ever return? And what of the house itself, Blackwood Manor? Does it still stand on that lonely northern moor, holding its secrets within its cold stone walls? The story is incomplete, a fragment of a nightmare. Margaret Henshaw, or the women who bore her name, have been forgotten by history, just as the note intended. Her voice, preserved in these brittle pages, is the only proof she ever existed at all. And it is a voice that cries out from the past, begging for an answer. And so I present this story to you, not as a piece of fiction, but as a genuine mystery. I believe that evil can linger in a place, infecting it like a disease. And I believe that some memories are too strong to be erased. They echo through time, waiting for someone to listen. Perhaps someone out there knows the name Blackwood Manor. Perhaps an old map or a local legend holds a clue. The story of Margaret Henshaw deserves an ending. If you know anything, anything at all, I urge you to come forward. Because some silences do not bring peace. Some silences scream.
Thank you for watching Eerie Britain. Don't forget to like and subscribe.